So you're
like you're saying because I was talking a little bit about like you and games and whatnot. Um, I mean, and we've talked briefly about how like like some of the sometimes like you can't role play some of the classes that are available in the game because they don't make sense in the lore.
right.
Um, did you have any particular any more thoughts on that or?
Personally, now this is my own personal taste. I tend to be very lenient about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've just gotten to the point in role play where
Mm-hmm.
I've been in the high scrutiny groups. I've seen, kind of what it's like to be a part of that role play, and I find it very toxic
Mm.
overall. So, like, if someone wants to roleplay a black mage, for example, which is supposed to be a very taboo thing, there's all sorts of rules around it. Like, if they really want to do it, I'll just be like, okay, you do you.
Right,
I
right.
don't
You have fun with
care.
that. Right,
Right.
right. Maybe this isn't my scene. Maybe I'm gonna be eager to roleplay. But, you
Right.
know, you're not
Like,
gonna yell at them about ruining the game and.
right, because I'll do little splits like that too. Because like one of my main characters is a summoner in character, which is
Right,
supposed to be a very rare thing. But in recent story updates in the game, they've made it much more accessible war-wise. Because before it was like summoning was a lost art by the Allegan Empire, which is a non-existent civilization. Oh my god, that's a Final Fantasy story. Oh my god.
right,
Um,
right,
and so like the Warrior of Light discovers summoning through XYZ, finds someone who's studying it, and they discover it together.
right,
But then in the most recent expansion, they wrote a little thing in the story that the one of the factions is starting to train summoning to their
right,
spellcasters. So
right,
now all of a sudden there's an in-lore explanation for players to be able to play an in-character summoner. Oh well, that project that's
right,
happening. I was trained by someone from that, or I joined that program, or
right, right.
suddenly there's explanations for that. It's also like I'll go back to Star Wars: The Old Republic too, because there's a lot of people that will like role play Jedi that aren't a part of the Order anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and like it's a very cop out. Uh, uh, Story writing. Like, oh well, they left the order, so
Right, right, right.
they're a rogue Jedi now, or they're a gray Jedi. Gray Jedi's. Don't even get me started. Um, Most cop out answer is, oh, I'm a gray Jedi. I do both light and dark. Fuck off. Anyways, um,
How do you feel? Don't hold on.
oh my goodness, that like. We'll get into that. Okay, we'll get into it. I promise.
Star Wars ranting.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. I'm
probably.
trying to control my Star Wars ranting here. Um, I will tend to just for like 14. I'll just be like, okay, the developers don't really care either, so why should I?
Right,
Like you with a lot of like the class quests and whatnot, you get a very strong sense that the developers aren't putting a whole lot of effort into these
right,
stories
right.
overall.
Or that like the stories, like a lot of the restrictions and whatnot, like black magic's supposed to be kind of like a rare thing. There's less about like verisimilitude in the world and more like, ooh, look, you're special for learning this lost art.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's more about empowering like the Warrior of Light character in the
Right.
story arc than it is about. Honestly, in a lot of the Realm Reborn storytelling, I don't think they took role players into consideration when they were writing it.
Right.
I don't think they were in a stance where they really could worry about, oh, but what a role player's gonna do about this.
Right. Right.
It's more like, okay, we need content. Let's
Right.
make content.
Oh god, we need content. Okay, yeah.
Somebody write something and just make it interesting. Okay. Black mages. Badass. Here.
Right. Right.
So, like, you gotta kind of take that into consideration. So, with the Star Wars stuff,
Right.
it all depends on what your source is. If you're trying to refer to, like, a particular book for something, or if you're trying to refer to one of the comic books, like, it's all different. So, I want to take Grey Jedis for a very particular example.
Alright. Continue.
For roleplay. Star Wars Galaxies, bad place or worst place in the timeline for RP? Actually, it's actually, okay. I'll get into that later. In a minute. Let me finish this one.
One rant at a time.
Yeah. So, Grey Jedi has two definitions in Star Wars lore. It has the book definition, or the extended universe definition, where it's a Jedi who has developed a strong enough understanding of the Force where they can use both light and dark Force powers without succumbing to corruption from either of them. They walk a purely neutral path. Now, I think those books that went into that were written in the 80s, if I remember correctly. So it was all about kind of like the 80s cool factor. If I remember correctly. I don't remember the exact books that wrote the Grey Jedi stuff came from. But I think it was in the 80s. So like a lot of that was before the whole like Phantom Menace prequels, like rules of the Jedi were really established.
Right.
So once the official Jedi rules came out, all of a sudden, like, Grey Jedi started making less and less sense, but it was such of an interesting concept that people in roleplay were just like, oh no, I really like that because I don't want to be restricted by, like, all these emotional rules and order rules. I just want to be a cool lightsaber wielding, space wizard.
Right.
So they use the Grey Jedi as an outlet for that motif. So the other definition of Grey Jedi is the like canon definition, which is a Jedi who does not necessarily abide to and agree with the rulings of the Jedi Council. So they will act with autonomy in their own decision making. Which is something that's frowned upon in the Jedi Order, but it's not necessarily against their rules.
Right.
The largest example of that is Qui-Gon Jinn, because like he took Anakin as his apprentice. They made several points in the Phantom Menace for Obi-Wan to reprimand his master, being like, if you keep arguing with them, they'll never put you on the council. And Qui-Gon's just like, meh, whatever.
Right. Yeah, I don't care.
Because he felt like he was listening to the Force, and the Force was guiding him in a way that contradicted the rulings of the Order. So he would put his faith more in the he put his faith more in the Force than he would the ruling of his superiors.
Right.
But he wouldn't break the rules in the process. He would simply have his own interpretation of the rules.
Right.
Which then the council would just kind of be like, Qui-Gon!
You scam!
Right, exactly. And then that's where, like, Obi-Wan, in the later movies, Obi-Wan's whole, like, oh, well, it was a matter of perception,
Right.
Perspective.
Right.
And that whole meme started. So, like, and for Star Wars roleplay, it all depend on what source you're citing for what kind of roleplay you're trying to make, which very much changes how you interact with people. So, like, Star Wars roleplay is very complicated in that sense. It's just like, well, are you referring to the 2001 interpretation of this concept, or are you like, which source of the Death Star plans are you using? The
Right.
Because that got retconned 6 times through 5 different books. It's actually a fascinating story. Look it up sometime. Anyways, so Star Wars Galaxies. I'm gonna label this segment the Star Wars rant.
Yeah, the Star Wars. Now the inedible Star Wars rant.
Okay, Star Wars Galaxies, bad or worst place in the timeline for roleplay? Actually, it's a better place in the timeline than the Old Republic is. So
Okay. Continue.
So, because in the Old Republic, like, everything was very, very kind of defined and established through, like, the Knights of the Old Republic and the peripheral material around the game. So, like, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room to play with for the kind of stories that you wanted to write. It was very, very defined. Like I said, you had to determine what lore you were following based on what year it was, you know. So in Star Wars Galaxy, so you have to keep in mind though that at the time of Star Wars Galaxies, the canon was very different because there was the inclusion of the extended universe, which had more than 10 universes in canon, more than 10 Jedi in the universe at the time. There were several books that were written of Jedi surviving in hiding, and like the Kenobi books, for example. So like there was some wiggle room to say, oh well, my Jedi is just a hidden survivor, or was a youngling that escaped the temple, so they grew up in secret with their master, or what have you. Like there was a lot of wiggle room in role play to explain why you're a Jedi. But it also made it interesting because you could also role play being a Jedi in hiding. So you could play as a different class, or mind you, I'm talking about post NGE. So because that's when I played.
Mm.
So like the whole like Jedi grind, that was before my time role playing.
Right.
So like you could role play, you know, being a Jedi in hiding. So maybe you would run around playing as a bounty hunter, you know, with a sniper rifle, but you're secretly, you know, role playing like a Force sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't bad, but like Jedi, and I did role play in a Jedi Order where we had, you know, we had an Imperial guild that we cooperated with to make roleplay stories happen. So like we very much had like this rule of, okay, well, if you know you're running around town in character, don't have your lightsaber equipped, you know, that kind of stuff, or else the Imperial team would be allowed to call you out on it. So we would have rules established on what was, you know, what to expect if certain thing, you know, in character consequences for certain things. Now, if you're just out playing the game, farming mobs, you could just declare out of character.
Right.
Oh, we're the only two here.
Are we? Oh.
Yeah. Oops.
Oh well.
So like you just declare out of character if you were running around with your lightsaber out. But then like you couldn't just swap back in character. You'd have to. You know.
It's almost like a PvP fight. You can't just, you know, be in character, out of character whenever it's convenient.
Right. Because then people could call you out on that, and then like your guild, the you know, whoever's in charge of you would get an earful of it, and then they'd have to, you know, reprimand you, and there were consequences for trying to play the system.
Right.
But I think Star Wars Galaxies was more interesting because there were more. You could have more interesting interactions with like Imperial role players if they were, you know, playing fair.
Right. If they're playing to build the stories instead of just to win or.
Right. So like you could actually end up having like these massive PvP fights that would end up, you know, becoming like a role play event, impromptu, for example.
Right.
Where you know, you got some Imperials attacking, you know, hanging out around a rebel base, a rebel aligned city or whatever. Well, then, you know, you could have a whole bunch of rebels showing up to defend, you know, just to set the lines, and then, you know, it could easily turn into a PvP fight. It could easily turn into a roleplay fight, depending on, you know, what flavor everyone's in the mood for.
Right.
Where in like the Old Republic, you know, the lines were crossed. You know, there were very, very defined lines where, you know, there were Imperial planets, there were, you know, Republic planets, and there were neutral planets. And most of like the cross faction roleplay happened on the neutral planets because,
right,
you know, you couldn't get to the other side's planets. So I found the roleplay in Star Wars Galaxies a little more enticing because there was more mixing. There was more, I guess,
more possibility space.
Yeah. Because
right.
Even in story, you know, the rebels and the Imperials are fighting over territories.
Right.
In like the Outer Rim, around Tatooine, and now the hard part was Naboo. Because the Naboo was a very Imperial-centric planet, but had a lot of rebel allied areas. So it's a very kind of weird place to roleplay, because you had to, like, if you're a rebel, you had to acknowledge that you were on an Imperial planet, even though there were a bunch of rebel-friendly areas.
Right.
It was a very confusing place. So like for that sense, I felt like Star Wars Galaxies was a bit better. And the other things that Star Wars Galaxies roleplay wasn't just Jedi centric. Like there was tons of like smuggler roleplay going on. At least on my server, there was tons of Rebel Imperial roleplay. Where on the Old Republic, like 90% of the roleplay I ever found was like Jedi centric, and that kind of got on my nerves really hard. Because there's only 4 classes you can play. There's the Jedi classes and then the not Jedi classes.
Right.
So half the players in the game theoretically had lightsabers. So it was just kind of like meh.
Right, and that was of course that was one of the big failings that people said about Star Wars Galaxies, is that, you know, it was a anti-barrier simulator. You know,
right.
When people wanted to just play Jedi, but like, you know, yeah, as far as whereas maybe that makes the, like, you know, kind of the personal heroic story seem better. It kind of makes for worse roleplay, because then it really kind of, you know, constrains. It constrains basically, you know, what you can do with the roleplay.
Right.
Interesting.
But I thought there was more genuine RP involved in the Star Wars Galaxies, because there's just more like character types and class types you could play with. Like you could play a doctor.
Even in the era of the Old Republic, you know, not everything wasn't. Everyone wasn't a Jedi.
Right.
And Jedi were supposed to be kind of the special protectors.
Even though they were at the time supposed to be like freaking everywhere, but.
Right, but they're not everybody. I mean, you still have the common folk to take care of.
Right, exactly. And like a lot of complaints that people had was just like a lack of weapon types. Cause like if you wanted to be a Force user like out of character, but not a Force user in character, then you had very few weapons you could actually equip. and most of them were gaudy and god awful looking.
Right.
Like if you're a Jedi Knight class, for example, like you had 4 non-lightsaber weapons you could get, and they all were like cash shop vanities.
Right.
So like to get one of them was just annoying. Like I had like the Cathar War Sword, and it's supposed to be like this non-lightsaber sword skin, but it was humongous and gaudy and looked awful. And I had it, but I didn't like using it because it didn't make sense for my character, who's supposed to be like a spear person.
Right.
So she had like a double-bladed lightsaber.
Right.
That's the closest thing I could get to like a spear.
Right.
And so like like if I said she had a spear, well, there was a double-bladed warglaive, Cathar warglaive, and I used that a lot for like being a spear, but it wasn't, you know, a spear. I had to take the creative license of describing it as a spear, and the point needs to be healed.
Oh. Right. And so yeah, you I mean, and you know, I have that bit I'm sure in Final Fantasy where, you know, sometimes there's not very realistic options for, you know, weapons that you can use. You know, if you're a paladin, you know, you have to wield a sword. There's no mace. Maces don't even exist in the game, I don't think.
No.
So.
Dijar says I would have assumed there was more RP because Star Wars Galaxy was much more sandboxy. That's fair. Because like you can make your own cities, you could kind of cultivate your own personal environments. And the development team was much more accommodating to the roleplay community as well. We actually had a few events where we actually were able to request a GM to NPC for us in our event. And this was before the storytelling system was implemented, where you could spawn in your own NPCs and enemies and stuff like that, and scenery. This was before that system had been introduced. So, like, if you wanted to do an event where you had AT-ATs roaming up on you, and you had, you know, starships flying across the Sky Dome, you had a ticket for a GM to come in an NPC for you, and they would set up the triggers and events for you to happen. So it was much more accommodating because you could get these big, huge sceneries to happen around your event. Like if you wanted a war scene where there was, you know, armies fighting against each other, you could get the developers to make that happen for you. For no cost or anything. You just had to send a ticket in with an explanation of what you wanted, and then one of the customer service reps would get in touch with you and schedule a time with you for what you wanted. Which the only other game that I know that did that, I think EverQuest had a system where GMs could get involved with things like for marriage, maybe. They had a limited amount of stuff where they could do, like, you know, they would kind of just like show up and do kind of a surprise, you know, event. But the flip side of that was also like that, you know, they also had they eventually did have like a premium service, right,
where basically you could go in and like if you spent $40 a month, and then basically they would literally have people come in and spawn stuff for you.
Right.
But, like, I don't think they had a whole lot of like, you know, we want to do this role playing event. Can you come in and spawn stuff for us?
Right. The only other game that I know that had any kind of GM interaction with that was Final Fantasy XI. Would have weddings where GMs would be the officiate.
Right.
They're fishiary. That's the word
Right.
I'm looking for. But yeah, like Star Wars Galaxies, they had this GM come in for this big event. Like it was like the climax battle for this story arc that we've been doing for months.
Oh wow.
And like I didn't even know this was something that the GMs would do. But we had this person come in that, you know, I'd never met before. And I wasn't in the planning for any of this. I was just a participant.
Right.
And like so we had this like had to escort this NPC or whatever, but it wasn't an NPC, it was a person. And I'm like, okay, that's weird. And then like AT-AT started showing up and ATSC started showing up, and I was like, what the fuck is happening right now?
Right. Excitement.
And X-Wings battling TIE fighters in the Sky Dome, and I'm just like, what is happening?
Right.
And I had to ask people like in the middle of things. I'm like, what is going on? They're like, oh yeah, that's a GM. And we're like, I'm just like, are you serious? Do we worship them? Do we like bow to them? Like, what's happening?
Right.
Like,
Right. Is there going to be a payment later? Yeah. Do we have to collect food as an offering?
right? Do I have to sacrifice a goat? Like, what's happening right now?
I have to order them pizza.
Oh my god, how great would that be? Like, oh yeah, I'll officiate your event. Just like send a pizza to the office. Like,
Hey, that'd be nice.
oh my god, that'd be freaking hilarious. Anyways, now that we're done talking about Star Wars.